Now, the U.S. national debt. What is the national debt? Well, it is nothing more than the money that the United States government owes to its creditors, owes to those who it borrows money from. Specifically, the national debt refers to the level of federal debt held by the public as opposed to the debt held by the government itself. Since the U.S. government almost always spends more than it takes in, the national debt does continue to rise day after day. And this can be a troubling thought, especially knowing what we know about debt, knowing how debt can be negative and how debt can negatively affect our lives. It's important to note that the United States does have as much debt as it does. And I think it'd be interesting to just begin this conversation by talking about how much debt do we really have as a country? Well, that's a relatively easy question to answer, and obviously the clock is always running, but there is a website you can go to, usdebtclock.org, and it tells you the amount up to the second of United States debt that there is outstanding. And the U.S. national debt is currently standing at about $27.79 trillion. So this is a very significant amount of money that we owe to our creditors as a country. And if you go and you break that down by individual, so per citizen, that is $83,972 per U.S. citizen. And then per taxpayer, because obviously not all citizens are taxpayers in the United States, then per taxpayer you have $222,191 of debt. And then we obviously have a federal deficit as well. And so the current federal deficit, based on this national debt clock, is just below $3.2 trillion. And then the U.S. federal spending is right around $6.65 trillion. So these are just huge numbers that it's very, very hard to even imagine this much money and how we owe this much money. Now, a big thing over the long term that you want to be looking at to see if a country is in good financial shape or not is their debt to GDP ratio, because the GDP is the gross domestic product of a country, and the gross domestic product is nothing more than the summation of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. That is the GDP. Now, in 1960, the debt to GDP ratio was 53.37%. So the debt was 53% of the amount of GDP, the amount of goods and services we were putting out annually. And then it dropped by 1980 to about 34.5%. And so that's obviously a good thing. When your debt to GDP falls, that means you have less debt relative to the amount of production you are contributing to the economy. And then by 2000, it increased to 59.6%. But today, as it stands today, we are sitting at 130.57%. We are sitting where our debt exceeds our GDP as a country by about 1.3 times. And that is astounding. That is crazy. That is obviously not what has happened historically. We've kept our debt below our GDP output over the course of history, but that is no longer the case. And then the question really comes, is this problematic? Is this an issue? And obviously this idea of the national debt has been a big point of contention over the past few years, and especially in 2020 and 2021 as we are beginning this year, because there has been a large amount of fiscal stimulus pumped into the economy. There has been a large amount of money that has been pumped into the economy, and that money does not come from nowhere. That is a part of our federal deficit. That is a part of this national debt. Now, there's obviously a difference between budget deficits and the national debt. The budget deficit is nothing more than did the federal government bring in less in revenue, basically, in the form of taxes and the like, than we actually spent. And then the national debt is nothing more than the accumulation of the federal government's annual budget deficit. So as we have more deficits, the debt will continue to grow and grow. Now, answering the question of whether or not this is a problem, answering the question of whether or not having a lot of debt or having these large budget deficits is an issue, really comes down to, will the United States be able to continue paying their debt obligations over time? Will we be able to continue to service our debt over time? Now, obviously, there is the measure of debt to GDP, and that's something that is very commonly used, but sometimes that is not the best approach, because debt is not getting repaid with GDP. It is going to be repaid with tax revenues. And given that that is the case, then the question becomes, well, will we be able to pay down this debt as a country? And what a growing national debt does is it reduces the amount of tax revenue available to spend on other governmental services, because more tax revenue will have to be paid out as interest on the national debt, servicing that national debt. And over time, this shifts the expenditures and will cause people to experience a lower standard of living as borrowing for economic advancement projects becomes more and more difficult. So that's just one way in which this is going to negatively affect people over time, or can negatively affect people over time.